Another great topic about property management is inspections. Again, property management isn't just managing property or handling repairs. It's about advertising property for rent. It's about rent collection. It's about customer service to your tenant. Because as a landlord, you are a business owner. You're renting your home to a customer. If they are a good customer, you want them to be a happy customer, to continue to take care of your property, to pay rent. But what if they're a bad customer? And how do we know whether they're good or bad? Some people say, oh, well, they're a really good tenant. They pay rent on time. That doesn't make you a good tenant. That makes you complying with what you're supposed to do in paying rent. What makes a good tenant is someone who has a good behavioral pattern in how they care for the property along with lease compliance and paying rent. And what makes a good landlord is someone who cares about their tenant's customer experience at the property and not just about collecting the rent. Also, circling back to inspections, this is an opportunity for us to measure or observe how your customer is taking care of the property that you've leased to them. There are various approaches or modus operandi in inspections. The classic inspections are the move-in inspection or the condition basis, which is recorded when the tenant takes over the lease, which the tenant will therefore be judged by as their basis condition moving throughout the lease experience and at the end of the lease. There should be an interim inspection. There's different property managers that have different protocols or schedules for their inspections. Sometimes they're seasonal related. Sometimes they're more often if a property is empty and less often if the property is occupied. This year in particular, many property managers said, no, we're opting to not do inspections during a pandemic for concern out of the health of our inspectors and also for concern out of what we bring into the houses that are tenant occupied. It's just important to understand what is that plan and what does that plan lead to success for you as a landlord or not, based on what your property manager's guidance is. My team and I, we are believers that it's now more important than ever to do property inspections because the homes are being lived in more. People are using them more. They're working from home more. And when there's more use on the property, more behavioral patterns and a different behavioral pattern takes place than the pre-pandemic behavioral patterns. So as a property manager, we find it more important than ever to perform inspections, to see how this behavioral use is affecting the property, and also to make sure that their tenants' continual use of the property is meeting their needs as your customer. The approach of an inspection should not just be to check in on the tenant. It's also how can we communicate with the tenant to observe their needs of the home. So when we talk about these inspections, there's lots of different plans. Some people do quarterly. Some people believe in doing inspections, short notice to catch the tenant in whatever state the property's in. I'm a believer that if you have a good customer as a tenant, you don't want them to feel spied on. You want them to feel like you or your property manager cares about the interaction with them. And I also find it much more powerful, especially on these interim inspections during the middle of the lease, to let the tenant know, hey, we're coming a week in advance. And the idea of why this is so much more powerful is if I say I'm coming next week, let's say the tenant was in violation of A, B, C, and D on the lease. And before the inspection, and they know we're coming, and they get everything cleaned up, and the house looks great when we show up for the inspection, and they say everything's working fine, we don't need anything. What we observed is that the house can be cleaned up within a week, and that when we did the inspection, it looked great. And that's what you want. You want the property to be able to be kept up with, cleaned, easily brought back into shape. If we give the tenant a week's notice and they're still in violation of A, B, C, and D, and the behavioral patterns show this major negative effect, and they tried to clean up, it's much more powerful because they're either apathetic that we gave them the notice, or that's the best they can do, and that information tells us something needs to change with the compliance in the lease. Gaining compliance has a lot to do with communication, both legal communication as well as expectation communication of what's happening on the lease and what track we need to get on. And a property manager's ability to enforce what's happening in the lease is dependent on the observations in these inspections. So I think it's very important that inspections are happening, pandemic or not, that they're happening in a respectful way that honors the tenant's living experience as a customer in your property, and also that the inspector themselves is observing certain things at the home and relaying that information to the landlord to provide the value of the inspection is valueless if there's no report being generated, if there's no pictures of the issues, if it's not being communicated to the landlord as well. So in terms of the necessity of the inspection, I would recommend high importance of the necessity of the inspection. The timeline, it's often a good idea to check to make sure properties are winterized, where markets dictate that winterization is important for the property. Other marketplaces outside of the DC market might have different seasonal needs for inspections. And it might be more important to check on the property when it's empty in a cold snap, or before or after a heavy rainstorm or special weather event. So all these things are causes for inspections, but a schedule should include one that's not obtrusive or intrusive to the tenant, yet is informational for the landlord in observing the behavioral patterns on the property. Don't confuse a property management inspection with a home inspection. When you're buying or selling a home, a professionally licensed home inspector is usually a part of the contractual process of evaluating the property. And it is a much more intensive inspection on the functionality and the code compliance of the property. In a property management or lease inspection or walkthrough, it's much more focused on observing the compliance of the lease. Is the tenant taking care of the home the way that they've agreed to in the lease terms? And are there any behavioral patterns that are negatively affecting the property? As well as, is there anything that the consumer needs, or the customer, the tenant needs? It's an opportunity to ask them, how is the property working for them? Are there things that would make the property a better living experience for them, that they might be more interested in renewing their lease if it was taken care of? Or they'd be willing to pay a little bit more rent if this deck was added on, or whatever it is at the property. There might be improvements that could lead to a greater output for the property if we are listening to the customer's needs and wants as well.